Hi. When we think about the influence, we often think about the policy, technological, or corporate decisions that are made at higher level. But do we ever think about how the perceptions and awareness at masses is created when it comes to building the trust and shape the societal changes? So one of the most subtle and powerful ways to deliver is through communication, using strategic, thoughtful, and clear messages that aligns and guides behavior to build trust and understanding across the complex systems. At Information Commission's office, communication isn't just about messaging, it's about balancing privacy, transparency, and innovation, making complex regulations understandable and influencing not only organizations but also citizens to act responsibly. It's a high stake endeavor that affects every person in the UK. Today, we are diving into how impact is created at scale through strategic storytelling, clarity, and messaging. We will explore decisions, trade offs, and leadership that make communications not just a function, but lever for societal influence. My guest today is Angela Balakrishnan, a Senior Director of Communications and Public Affairs at ICO, a multi-award winning communication leader who has spent her career shaping policies, trust in highly complex and high-stake environments. In this conversation, we will focus on the real-world impact of the campaigns and the messaging she has worked on, how campaigns are designed, how decisions were made, and how strategic storytelling can influence behaviors and build trust at scale in public and private sectors. This is Influencers of Change. I'm your host, Sayali Waghmare, and this is the conversation about impact at scale through strategic storytelling, clarity, and messaging. Hi, Angela. How are you doing?
Good. How are you? Thanks for having me, Sayali.
I'm good. Thank you so much for joining us today.
I think you've introed me well, so I'll just say hello.
To kick off with the first question, we would like to know more about the context and establish why communication is so critical at a societal and regulatory level and how you manage, because the balancing the privacy and transparency can be critical, and that is your job. And we would really like to know about it from you.
Yeah, I guess on the face of it, like protecting your information and then being transparent can feel like it's contradictory. But I think the thing that connects both of these things are trust, and trust is integral to how data protection and transparency work. So I don't think the two things are maybe as in tension as they may appear. We need to make sure that when people share their information, they can trust that they know how it's going to be used, how it's going to be shared, how it's going to be protected. And I think how organizations are transparent about what they're doing with people's information can really help cultivate that trust and encourage people then to sort of want to share their information and want to share it sort of confidently if they're going to engage in kind of products and services. So I think kind of coming to the kind of foundations of trust are how the two things are linked. And communications has a huge role to play in building that trust, because it can help explain things that feel very technical or very complex in ways that people can kind of understand and relate to. It can help shift and change behaviors by kind of encouraging specific actions or encouraging people to sort of think or see things in a certain way. And it can build that kind of trust through connectivity. I think when, one of the fundamental parts of great communications is being able to tell good stories and form that kind of human connection with people. And I think the way that we engage different audiences and different stakeholders is really key to building that trust.
That's very interesting. You mentioned that trust is definitely an integral part, and that's how you build through the communications. So I'm assuming there must be so many different challenges that you face when it comes to curating that communications to diverse audiences. But what are the key misunderstandings or the challenges that you face, and how do you tackle that? If you can give any examples.
Sure. I think every comms person has probably faced the challenge of having to work with teams within their organization. And you ask, right, what are we trying to communicate and who to? And it can be very difficult to pin down the specifics of that. So, what is the objective of what we're trying to communicate, and the classic, who are we trying to communicate to? Oh, well, everyone. And that's never true. Like every piece of communication linked to an organization's work has a very clear goal or outcome that they're trying to achieve, and often that's with a very clear and intended audience. So I think being really targeted about what you're trying to do and focused on what you're trying to shift can really help. And that's certainly true for us at the ICO. We are quite a unique regulator in that we're not sector specific. We regulate the whole economy because data is part of everything, and everything part of what we see and what we do. So we have to make some really key choices about where we can best add value based on the unique role that we play in the regulatory ecosystem. And we have to base that as well on like where we see some of the biggest risks, like where does trust matter the most? Where can our interventions help? And that helps to kind of, I think, focus our effort and make some choices about what we are going to do and maybe what we're not going to sort of lean into as much.
That's so interesting. To dive more into the strategies and the system that plays very important role to make this communication effective, would you share an example where you had to translate the complex regulations or the data information into something that could be understandable? Because you said you address that message to everyone basically. And you are a very integral part, an important part of the economy. Do you have any example where it has played very important role and shifted the behaviors massively among the public?
Yeah, absolutely. So a really good example that comes to mind is a campaign that we actually won a couple of awards for, and it was all around nuisance marketing calls. So these are calls that I'm sure we've all experienced where you get an unknown number or a number that you don't recognize calling you, and it's often trying to sort of sell you something that you don't need, and you often think, oh gosh, how did they get my number? So these spam calls, we call them nuisance marketing calls, can actually sometimes turn into something a bit more sinister. Working across our organisation, so with our investigations team and also our public complaints hotline, we had spotted a trend where calls were being deliberately targeted towards elderly people or people who were in kind of a vulnerable state, whether they had like mental health or health conditions, and they were being preyed on to try and missell them white goods insurance, so insurance for things like fridges, washing machines, dishwashers, and often insurance that they didn't really need. So we thought, okay, this is something that we can help support the work of our investigations team by doing some kind of comms campaign around it. Using that insight, we kind of found out with our public complaints team that often these cases aren't reported by not the individual receiving the call, but it's often like a family or a friend or a loved one who's reporting it on their behalf. And so using that insight, we devised a campaign called Help Gran, Stop Spam. And so the kind of Gran part of it, I was a mnemonic with a kind of clear call to action that if you were a grandchild or a niece or a nephew or a son or a daughter, and you had an elderly relative who was experiencing these calls, and a very kind of clear advice of like what you can do to support them and a kind of clear call to action about what you could do and where we could kind of step in to help. So kind of the two key things were basically hang up the call. You don't need to engage often in these conversations. It's absolutely fine to not be polite and just cut the call. Register with the telephone preference service. So this is a service called the TPS that helps block spam callers. And the third one was to report the call to the ICO, because then that gives us more intelligence so that we can kind of take on more investigatory action. And so we'd already had a bundle of cases that we were able to sort of highlight. But over the course of this campaign, which I think was about sort of a 6-month period, and through kind of a strategy of earned and owned media, focusing on that kind of cohort of loved ones and also a slightly elderly population, we were able to see, I think, an 80% increase of people who then registered with the telephone preference service. And I think over 26,000 calls reported to the ICO, which then was able to sort of spark a new wave of investigations to help target and clamp down on these spam callers. And we also very deliberately renamed them. So rather than just calling them nuisance marketing, we actually renamed them as predatory marketing, because this was more than just a nuisance. They were often targeting these elderly people quite deliberately with a view to sort of scamming them of their life savings with quite sort of, harmful, long-lasting consequences. So it wasn't just like a nuisance. It was actually something that was quite predatory. And I think that was one of the first examples where we worked so closely with the operational teams and the kind of public-facing teams of the ICO and showed how like the work that we can do through communications and engagement can sort of directly help their kind of objectives of what those teams are trying to sort of tackle and achieve.
That's awesome. I looked up, there was a post from your account a few days before how data is just not a number. And this is like a perfect example how behaviors can be understandable from the data, and it can be used to create the curated messaging for the public. And wow, that's amazing. So while you were working on this whole campaign, so what are the key trade-offs that you have to do usually? Because like every organization has their way of working, and we would really like to know how your organization works and what are the trade-offs, regulations, and the work that goes behind to run this huge campaign.
I think it comes back to being like focused and making choices about where we think we can make the greatest impacts, and whether it's as an organization or as a communications team, like where our interventions add the most value. So we don't go after every issue with the same intensity. We don't lend our voice to every kind of issue that has data related to it, because that would be everything all at once. So I think there's something around choices. And I think with this campaign in particular, what I was really proud about was kind of taking quite an integrated and collaborative approach to how we delivered it. So rather than kind of seeing sort of silos between our stakeholders, our digital channels, our press work, and even like our operational teams, it was from the outset of this campaign building a team that was collaborative to its core and could see how each kind of part of the puzzle helped deliver that greater impact. So, for example, we had a kind of a very deliberate press strategy that went after sort of key national sort of tier one media, but also media that had that target audience in mind. So Rip Off Britain, and we had articles in some of the kind of big broadsheets, but we also had quite a kind of integrated stakeholder strategy. So we worked with stakeholders like training standards, action against fraud, and Age UK to make sure that the things that we were doing were being amplified through their channels as well.
And you also mentioned that you don't tell all the stories from the data that you receive. So how do you decide which stories and messaging or which campaigns to run?
I think it's looking at the kind of insight and where, again, we have a unique chance to add value and make that kind of intervention, but also where we can see an impact that maybe affects a wider ecosystem. So a good example is a campaign that we've been running still sort of in existence called the Ripple Effect. And the Ripple Effect was born out of some insight that we gathered from our stakeholders, as well as our data breach data that we hold. And it showed that lots of often public sector, but not just public sector, sort of wider organizations were not treating the information of people who will often be in kind of vulnerable or experiencing vulnerable situations with the sensitivity that it requires. So the two sort of bits of insight that we had were domestic abuse survivors, often having their new safe address being disclosed to their abusers by like the organizations, the public sector organizations, social services who are meant to be keeping them safe.
Yeah.
And similarly, people living with HIV having their health status disclosed by a GP. So again, someone that you trust with that very sensitive information. Using that kind of insight, we carried out a bit more of a deeper dive into the issues to really understand like what was happening, but more importantly, I think the impacts of what these sort of disclosures of information were having on people. And we worked with Women's Aid and the National AIDS Trust and the Terence Higgins Trust to try and kind of tap into those communities and those groups who we wouldn't normally naturally have a connection to. And I think what we found, and we used a trauma-informed approach to research, but what we found was the implications of these disclosures could often last like years or decades. And it really did lead to like a breakdown in trust. With the kind of HIV example, people would then stop seeing their doctor. They would stop going, especially when they needed to, because they just felt like they couldn't trust their GP with quite sensitive information. But that obviously then had huge health ramifications for the individual involved. For the domestic abuse survivor, having to then move house again, pull their child out of school again, it really kind of uproots their whole lives. And the frustration was that often the organizations who were responsible for the breach were not realizing the severity of what they had done. They would just see this as like a data issue, like it was an admin issue, it was a mistaken email sent, or like, a slip of a a button, not really kind of grasping the gravity and the long-lasting consequences of their action. And I think there were kind of three parts to what we wanted to do as a result. One was like trying to get organizations to think and act differently. This isn't just like a data tick box. This is people's lives. And that's the value of the information that they're holding. They need to really treat it with the utmost respect and sensitivity. The second part was making sure that for the victims of these situations, they had a real clear resource of what they needed to do, because often the data part is just one element of the wider emotional distress that they are facing. So trying not to make it complicated or complex for them, like really easy to understand resources of like what they should do, where they could go for help, and recognizing that they might not always come to the ICO because they might not know who we are. So trying to like make sure that that information was seeded with like some of those kind of front door charities or community organizations where they might go for help. And then the third part was just looking at our own customer services and how could we use the insight of what we had gathered from talking to these individuals to make sure that we were also acting with more empathy and we were making sure that our kind of own services were in better shape. So those were kind of the three parts of the campaign. We did like a big public call to action and trying to, encourage organizations to really take the stuff more seriously and thinking about the implications of their actions. We produced this like clear resource for victims and we made sure that was distributed through organizations that they might access. And then we did like a whole training exercise with our own internal customer services to make sure that they were better equipped with handling some of these cases and these calls. And it was really positive. And I said like the campaign is still live, but in the kind of first 6 to 8 months, we saw, I think 2/3 of organizations saying that they were going to make changes to how they handled these cases, but also making sure that they were adjusting their own sort of practices and standards so that these like mistakes wouldn't happen as much. We saw a real positive response for the resource that we produced. And yeah, we've made some real clear changes to our own customer services as well.
Wow. Of course, this campaign, they work on very critical and sensitive topics or even the lives within the society to bring attention to those topics. But you also mentioned that you also have to work on the operations side. So how have you seen any campaign or the messaging that has transferred into some policy changes or that has impacted regulations to work differently?
I mean, in this example, it's like, we used insight from two groups, but I think the kind of lessons learned were much wider about getting organizations to just not see data as like an admin tick box exercise, but really trying to sort of place data and data protection as very human and people focused. And I think that has been the kind of long lasting legacy and impact of this campaign. We've seen huge amounts of kind of take up by sort of NHS trusts, water companies. It's been rolled out across central government as a kind of example of trying to get, again, organizations to think about what they do differently. And I think we haven't maybe seen a policy change, but we've seen practice changes as a result of this campaign.
So should we say that when it comes to metrics, we also measure that into this kind of qualitative factors?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's not just about, what the comms metrics were, but did it lead to real world behavior change or practice change? And I think we did see that in this instance.
Well, so when it comes to metrics or measuring the impact of the campaign, so you already shared some insights. So would you like to share what's your approach when you do that?
Yeah, so I mean, it's always specific to the piece of work, but we try to work strategically with the different teams that we are kind of supporting or working with for a piece of work or a project to really understand like what are the kind of regulatory objectives that we're trying to influence here so that we can develop a kind of comms and engagement strategy that directly supports that. So we always try and sort of find what is that line of thread between the activity that we might do towards the kind of end outcomes and goals that we want to see. So in the two examples that I've shared, with nuisance marketing, it was kind of trying to affect the people who were registering with that TPS and also the kind of calls being reported to us. So we were able to see as a result of the kind of campaign work and the visibility that we got, that helped drive a kind of positive change to those other wider metrics. And likewise, I think with the ripple effect, it wasn't just about coverage and kind of social media digital hits, it was like, are we seeing organizations change their practice or individuals change their behaviors as a result of our work? And I think we did see that. So we always try and think, okay, what is it that we want to see in terms of the end result, the real world impact, and how can we design a kind of comms strategy and plan that helps contribute towards that?
As being somebody who has worked on so many campaigns and who is at such a senior level, so what would you suggest when it comes to, or what are your takes on what makes communication strategy truly influential when it comes to bring bigger changes, whether it's national level or global level?
I think the thing that's really been a step change in the organizations that I've worked in is when communications is integrated as part of the organization's DNA. Making sure it runs from exec board level all the way through the entire organization. So it's not just like a bolt-on delivery service, but it's truly strategic. It's there from the outset of any work, helping to shape, what the objectives are and directly contribute to outcomes. I think communications, when it can be that voice in the room that brings the kind of outside in, it can understand and analyze sort of risk and translate that into kind of clear activity and strategy. I think that's when communications becomes a much more influential, impactful lever. So I'm really proud, for example, at the ICO, we sort of recognise now that comms and engagement is a regulatory tool that we have in our kind of toolbox in its own right. It's not just there to promote the activity, but it can actually be there to drive some of the outcomes that we want to see, whether that's behavior change or influencing trust or getting organizations to think, see, or do something differently.
And you also mentioned that every organization that you worked in, they work quite differently. So what are the lessons that you have learned and that shaped your direction completely, or that has built you the person you are, who is very credible? Because it might be very overwhelming when you see that everything is quite changing and the world is evolving enormous way, and then there might be some factors or the lessons that you have learned which stayed same and that shapes the work that you do or you have always been doing.
Well, I think starting with that very phrase, like lessons learned, I think our industry is never static. It's always changing, whether that's due to new practices, new tools, new sort of evolving external context. So being able to not sort of rely on how things were always done, and having that kind of hunger and curiosity to understand how your industry is changing, how the world around you is changing, and how your organization is evolving as well is key. We are, as part of one of the things I invested in very early on here at the ICA was our evaluation and measurement. And we use all of that to not just be able to demonstrate the impact that we're making and bring the organization along with us, but also to sort of be thinking about what is it that we're doing well, what could we be doing differently, and really challenging ourselves on that kind of lessons learned and constant kind of iteration and innovation. So I would say that that's the kind of primary thing for me. But going back to what I said before, like making sure that communications really is strategic, getting that voice at the table from the outset, and showing the impact, not just having that feedback loop internally as well with your teams and within your organization, so that you can explain what you're doing and showing the impact of what that's achieving. I think that grows a greater understanding and maturity of what the comms function can do beyond sort of press releases and websites and nice social content. It helps to really show the more strategic, influential role that comms can play.
That's a very good lesson. When it comes to, like you also mentioned that you also try to make other organization understand when it comes to messaging and the work that influences the work they do that influences the public. So what is the one key message that you would like to share with other organizations about the power of influence of the communications and how it can influence the trust and behaviors?
Maybe just write in plain English. I think, especially in the age of AI, we just need to make sure that we're kind of really de-jargonizing how we communicate and remembering that people connect to stories, and stories often are told in the simplest of terms. So I think that's kind of a good foundation, a good principle to build great communications on, which can get challenging when you're in complex organizations or situations.
That's very fascinating. Thank you so much. This was a great conversation. You have given us so many insights that to reflect on and also to build when it comes to communication. We are at the end of our podcast. So thank you, Angela.
Thank you so much for having me, Sayali.
Thank you so much for tuning in with Influences of Change. If you found this conversation valuable, please do follow and subscribe across your preferred platforms to stay updated on upcoming episodes and insightful stories. Thank you.